He gave up his voice to buy silence. But in that silence, he built a future no one could erase. Thomas Gray was 45 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with lines on his face that looked older than his years. For 2 decades, he had worked at Riverstone Steel Factory. Every morning, he carried the same dented tin lunchbox, walked the same cracked streets, and punched the same rusted time clock. Most men cursed the long hours and unfair pay. Thomas stayed silent. While others shouted at the managers, Thomas kept working. His silence made him invisible. Some called him weak. Others thought he was afraid. Nobody knew the truth. Thomas had once dreamed like every young man. But his mother's illness and broken love story left him alone, with no family and no savings. At 30, he had nothing for himself. One night while walking home, he saw children studying under a streetlight with torn books and empty stomachs. Something in their eyes reminded him of himself. That night, he made a choice. Instead of saving for his own life, Thomas began saving for theirs. He patched his old boots instead of buying new ones. He skipped luxuries, even small pleasures, and quietly sent money to pay for school fees and supplies. He created a trust account under no name. To the children, their helper was a mystery. They called him Mr. Nobody. Inside the factory, Thomas's silence became a burden. His coworkers muttered, "He is spineless. He is the boss's pet." But Thomas ignored the insults. At night, in his small room, he read letters from children thanking their unknown benefactor. One said, "Dear Mr. Nobody, I want to become a doctor one day, so I can help people like you helped me." Another wrote, "Whoever you are, I will work hard and make you proud." Those letters were Thomas's real wages. That was why he kept silent. He was not fighting for himself. He was buying silence to build futures. Every Friday, after receiving his wages, Thomas followed a routine nobody at the factory knew. While others headed to the bars, he walked down narrow streets to a small, dimly lit office near the community library. Behind a squeaky wooden door sat Mrs. Evelyn, an elderly woman who ran a neighborhood fund for children. She had known Thomas for years, but even she never revealed his secret. He would enter quietly, place an envelope on her desk, nod politely, and leave without a word. Each envelope held a portion of his weekly pay. Sometimes it was half his wages, sometimes more. Evelyn had asked him once, "Thomas, why do you sacrifice so much when you live with so little?" He had simply replied, "Because silence is cheaper than despair, and I can afford silence." That was all. After that, neither of them spoke about it again. Evelyn distributed the money carefully: uniforms for one child, school books for another, exam fees for a teenager on the edge of dropping out. Slowly, the mysterious contributions began to shape lives. But in the factory, Thomas's quiet generosity remained invisible. His coworkers noticed his worn-out clothes, his cracked boots, his empty lunchbox. To them, he was just a poor fool, too afraid to demand a better wage. The irony was sharp. The man they pitied for being voiceless was the very reason children outside the factory were finding their voices. One evening, Rosa, his closest friend at work, confronted him during their break. "Thomas, why don't you speak up? We are planning a protest for higher wages. You work harder than anyone, yet you never stand with us. Don't you care?" Thomas looked at her, his face calm but unreadable. "Not all battles are fought with fists or loud voices," he said softly. "Some battles are fought in silence. You will understand one day." Rosa frowned, confused and frustrated. To her, silence was weakness. She shook her head and walked away, muttering, "You're wasting your life, Thomas." What Rosa did not know was that on that very night, Thomas used his money to pay for Marcus Allen's school admission, a boy who had lost his parents and was nearly forced into child labor. Marcus would later grow into something extraordinary, but at that moment, all he knew was that a stranger had given him another chance. Thomas returned to his empty apartment, his dinner a simple piece of bread with soup. He sat on the edge of his bed and pulled out the latest letter from Eliana, the young girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor. She had written, "Mr. Nobody, I passed my exams. I am one step closer to my dream. Thank you for believing in me." Thomas smiled faintly. That smile was rare, but it gave him strength. Outside, the city was loud with protests, laughter, and music. Inside his room, there was only silence. But it was a silence filled with meaning. His sacrifice was invisible, his name forgotten. But his impact was growing louder in the lives of children, who did not even know his face. The Riverstone Steel Factory was more than a workplace. It was a city within a city, full of gossip, noise, and hidden rivalries. Among the clanging machines and smoky air, Thomas Gray's silence was becoming a story in itself. The men often gathered during lunch breaks in the dusty yard behind the warehouse. They sat on overturned crates, their hands greasy, their voices bitter. The topic was always the same: wages, foremen, and unfair rules. "They treat us like slaves," one worker spat. "We should shut this place down," another declared. But whenever eyes turned to Thomas, sitting quietly in the corner with his tin lunchbox, they shook their heads. "Look at him," someone muttered, too scared to even nod. "He's not one of us," another replied. "He's the boss's silent dog." Even Rosa, who once defended him, began to doubt. She cornered him again after work, her voice sharp with frustration. "Thomas, don't you see what's happening? They are cutting hours, cutting pay, and putting our lives at risk. You never speak, never join us. What are you afraid of?" Thomas paused. His hands were rough, scarred from years of labor, and his eyes seemed to look beyond the present moment. "I'm not afraid," he answered quietly. But sometimes, shouting is just noise. Silence can be a shield. "My battle is not the one you see." Rosa shook her head. She could not understand him. To her, silence meant surrender. To the others, it meant betrayal. As weeks passed, the rumors about Thomas grew darker. Some said he was secretly on the factory's payroll to keep the workers calm. Others whispered he was broken, a man with no pride left. Thomas heard it all, but he never explained himself. At night, in his small apartment, he unfolded more letters from children he had helped. Their words drowned out the insults of the factory floor. One letter said, "Mr. Nobody, I stood first in my class today. I wish I could meet you, but even if I never do, I will always carry your kindness in my heart." Those words reminded him that rumors were temporary, but education was forever. Yet even Thomas could feel the walls closing in. The silence he carried was becoming heavier each day. He was sacrificing his reputation, his friendships, and his dignity. But he reminded himself silence was not for him. It was for the children who would one day speak louder than he ever could. Winter came harsh and cold. The steel factory roared with machines. But the workers' anger was hotter than the furnaces. When the management announced layoffs, chaos erupted. Dozens of men would lose their jobs before the new year. The air outside the factory gates was thick with rage. Men shouted, waved their fists, and called for strikes. Rose's voice rang above them all. "We cannot let them destroy our lives. If we stand together, they cannot break us." The workers cheered, their voices echoing through the night. But Thomas stood apart, leaning silently against the wall. His heart was heavy. If he joined them and lost his job, the fund would collapse. Dozens of children would be pulled out of school. The dreams he had nurtured for years would vanish overnight. That night, alone in his apartment, Thomas stared at the stack of photographs on his table. Each picture showed a child he had helped, smiling faces in uniforms, holding books, holding certificates. He ran his rough fingers across them and whispered, "I cannot let them down. Not now." The next morning, when the strike began, Thomas walked past the angry crowd at the gate. "Where are you going, coward?" Someone yelled. "Traitor." Another shouted. Even Rosa glared at him with disappointment. But Thomas kept walking, his boots crunching on the icy ground. Inside the factory, the machines roared on, and Thomas carried his silence like a shield. That day, he became the most hated man in the factory. His coworkers stopped talking to him. No one sat beside him at lunch. His name became a curse. The isolation cut deep, but Thomas endured. At night, the pain in his chest grew sharper, his breathing heavier. His body was warning him that years of sacrifice were taking their toll. But he pushed the pain aside, whispering to himself, "One more day. One more paycheck. One more child saved." Silence had always been his choice, but now it was his prison. Still, he chose to stay inside it because outside, children were still studying under the light he provided. Time moved slowly, but Thomas kept going. Every Friday, the envelopes of money reached Mrs. Evelyn's desk, and every Monday, new opportunities opened for children. Marcus Allen, the boy Thomas had once saved from child labor, was now in high school. He studied with relentless focus, determined to honor the mysterious stranger who had changed his path. He dreamed of becoming a lawyer, someone who could fight against injustice. He often wrote letters to Mr. Nobody, promising, "I will make you proud. One day I will repay this gift, though I don't know who you are." Eliana, the girl who wanted to become a doctor, was now volunteering at a small clinic after school. She treated scratches and coughs for neighborhood children, telling everyone, "One day, I will wear a white coat. And when I do, it will be because someone believed in me when no one else did." Dozens of other children, whose names Thomas barely knew, were building futures step by step. Some learned trades, some went to college. Some simply stayed away from the streets because education gave them purpose. Thomas never told them it was him. He walked through the factory every day, ignored and insulted while outside. His silence bloomed like hidden seeds. Sometimes he sat at his small table, staring at the letters and photos, and wondered if they would ever know the truth. Would Marcus recognize him if they crossed paths? Would Eliana thank him if she saw his face? Or was it better that they never knew? In his heart, Thomas decided it did not matter. The seeds were planted. Whether or not he received thanks, the forest would grow. The factory men still hated him. Rosa barely spoke to him anymore. His boots were falling apart, his back ached constantly, and his chest burned with every breath. But when he closed his eyes, he could see the faces of children laughing, learning and living better lives. That vision was enough to keep him going. The man who bought silence was slowly breaking, but the silence itself was becoming louder than anyone imagined. The days after the strike were the loneliest of Thomas Gray's life. He walked through the factory floor surrounded by men who once greeted him but now turned their backs. The silence he had chosen for himself was different from the silence they forced upon him. This silence cut deeper. At lunch, no one sat beside him. In the locker room, men slammed doors when he entered. Even Rosa, his old friend, avoided his eyes. For the first time in years, Thomas began to question himself. "Have I been wrong?" He whispered at night, staring at the cracked ceiling above his bed. "Should I have shouted with them? Should I have fought for myself?" But when doubt crept in, he opened the small wooden box beside his bed. Inside were dozens of letters, each one written in shaky handwriting, each one filled with gratitude. One read, "Mr. Nobody, I was accepted into college. You saved me. Another said, "Because of you, I stayed in school. I am not on the streets anymore." The letters were proof that his silence had meaning. Yet his body was not as strong as his spirit. The chest pains grew worse. Some mornings he coughed so hard he thought his ribs would break. But he told no one. The factory had no patience for weakness, and he had no luxury to stop working. One evening, Rosa finally broke her silence. She found him alone on a bench outside the factory. His face pale, sweat dripping though the air was cold. "Thomas," she said softly, "why are you doing this to yourself? Everyone hates you. You are breaking down. Tell me what you are hiding." Thomas looked at her, his tired eyes carrying decades of unspoken truth. But he shook his head. "Not yet," he replied. "One day, Rosa, you will understand, but not yet." Then he stood, shoulders heavy, and walked away. That night, as the city lights flickered outside his window, Thomas collapsed onto his bed. His breath came in shallow gasps. In that darkness, one thought comforted him. Even if his life ended tomorrow, the seeds he had planted were already growing. It was a gray afternoon when the factory doors opened to an unfamiliar face. A young man in a crisp suit, carrying a leather briefcase, walked onto the floor. His voice was strong and confident. "I am looking for Thomas Gray," he announced. The workers froze. No one ever asked for Thomas. For 2 decades, he had been invisible. But the young man's eyes searched until they found him. Thomas, with grease on his hands and sweat on his brow, looked up slowly. The stranger smiled warmly. "Mr. Gray, you don't know me, but I know you. My name is Marcus Allen." Gasps filled the factory. Some men recognized the name. Marcus Allen was the new lawyer in town, who had made headlines for defending poor families and winning against landlords. Marcus walked straight to Thomas, his voice ringing for all to hear. "I was an orphan once. I had no chance, no future. But someone paid for my school, my books, my exams. I never knew who. Today, I came to say thank you, because I know it was you." The floor fell silent. Men who had mocked Thomas for years stood speechless. Rosa covered her mouth in shock. Marcus continued, his eyes shining. "Mr. Gray, I am who I am because of your sacrifice. You may not have spoken, but your silence built my voice. And I will use that voice to fight for you. And every man here, for the first time in 20 years. His silence was no longer misunderstood. The weeks that followed were like a storm. Marcus Allen returned, not as a visitor, but as a lawyer armed with documents, evidence, and truth. He revealed to the workers what they had long suspected. The factory had been stealing wages, cutting safety corners, and hiding illegal profits. Marcus had gathered proof, and with it, he built a case that could shake the company to its core. Standing before a crowd of workers one evening, Marcus raised his voice. "All these years, you called Thomas Gray a coward. But while you shouted, he was building us a weapon, me. His silence gave me the chance to learn, to fight, to return. Today, I speak for him and for all of you." The workers erupted in applause. For the first time, Thomas was not alone. The men who once despised him now looked at him with respect, even shame for their past judgments. Rosa stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Thomas," she whispered, "I am sorry. I never knew." Thomas only nodded. He had no anger, no bitterness. Silence had always been his shield, and now it had become his crown. The court battle was long and brutal. The factory's lawyers were powerful, but Marcus was relentless. He quoted laws, presented evidence, and exposed corruption with the fire of a man fueled by gratitude and justice. Thomas sat quietly in the back row of the courtroom, watching the boy he had once saved fight like a lion. He never needed to speak. Marcus's voice carried all the words, He had swallowed for 20 years. When the verdict came, the judge's voice was clear. The factory was guilty. Workers would receive back wages. Safety standards would be enforced. And corrupt managers were removed. The courtroom erupted in cheers. But Marcus raised his hand for silence. "This victory is not mine," he declared. "It belongs to Thomas Gray, the man who bought silence, and in doing so, gave us all a future." Life after the trial changed. The workers no longer saw Thomas as a coward. They greeted him with respect, shared their food with him, and invited him to sit with them. But Thomas did not care for attention. He continued his routine, the dented lunchbox, the quiet walk, the same old boots. Only now, when people looked at him, they saw dignity instead of weakness. The children he had once helped began to return, each carrying their own success. Eliana, now a medical student, visited him and said, "Mr. Nobody, I found you at last. I would not be here without you." Others came to teachers, mechanics, engineers, all carrying stories of how his silent sacrifice had changed their lives. One evening, Marcus sat with Thomas outside his small apartment. The lawyer had become a rising star, but in front of Thomas, he was still the boy with a second chance. "Mr. Gray," Marcus said, "you taught me the greatest lesson of my life. That silence, when chosen for the right reason, can be louder than any shout. You gave without asking, believed without proof, and sacrificed without applause." A few years later, Thomas Gray's journey reached its end. His body, worn from decades of labor and sacrifice, could no longer fight. He passed away quietly in his sleep, just as he had lived in silence. But his funeral was anything but silent. The small church overflowed with people. Children he had once helped stood as adults, now doctors, lawyers, teachers, workers, mothers, fathers. The workers from the factory came too, bowing their heads in respect. Rosa wept openly, remembering the man she once misunderstood. Marcus delivered the eulogy. His voice trembled as he spoke. Thomas Gray was called many things: coward, traitor, fool. But I stand here to tell you the truth. He was a warrior, a builder, a protector. He fought a battle none of us could see, and he won it not with noise, but with silence. His sacrifice lives in all of us. Every child he saved, every dream he planted, is his legacy. We are his voice now. The crowd stood in applause, tears streaming down faces hardened by life but softened by his story. Thomas Gray, the man who bought silence, had left behind a legacy louder than thunder. His life was proof that sacrifice is not weakness, silence is not surrender, and giving is the loudest legacy a man can leave behind. Moral lesson of the story is that true strength is not always in the noise we make, but in the sacrifices we keep hidden. Silence, when chosen for others, can echo louder than 1,000 voices. Be the reason someone else finds their future. Like and subscribe the channel for more interesting videos.